Hello everyone, it's Old Guardian here. In this Warcraft Rumble talent guide, I'm going to take a look at the best talent for each and every mini in the game. Yes, every single leader, every single troop, I have went through them all, and I'm going to give you advice on which talent you should pick first, which talent should be the second one, and which talent can be left as the third one. Because you get your first talent when your mini reaches uncommon, then the first talent slot opens up. And talents, you buy talents from the grid, but talents on the grid, it's random which talents are going to be shown to you, so it might take a while until you find the one that you really should pick, but you should wait for that, because once you buy a talent, you can't get rid of it. So then you have to get the mini to rare to open a second talent slot, so that then you can get another talent. A mini can only have one talent equipped at a time, but before you have multiple talent slots, the one talent that you have bought, you're stuck with that. So when you look for your talents, you want to look for something completely new, something that changes the abilities that the mini has, or you want to look for additional damage, especially poison. Poison is super strong in the game. You want to find ways to control the game with stuns and freezes. You want to find cost reduction. You want to find survivability. I have emphasized the completely new aspect a little bit more this time than previously, especially for the second talent for the mini, because many of these completely new abilities have actually found quite good uses, for example in raids, and you need to pick up the talent in order to get access to that ability. So there are timestamps for this video, so use the chapters in order to find whichever mini you want. And let's take a look at them. There's plenty of minis. Let's go. First up are the leaders. I have set it up so that the talents are listed in the order that you should purchase them. The best talent is the first one, then the second best, and the weakest talent is the third one. So for Jaina Proudmoore, clear casting is the best option. Clear casting spells cost one less, but no less than one if played immediately after Jaina, so you can't play any other minis in between. But Jaina has a dedicated spell slot anyway. You're typically using at least one spell, if not multiple spells with Jaina, and clear casting just makes those cheaper and more effective, and Jaina naturally gives them bonus levels, so Jaina for the bonus levels, clear casting for getting that cheaper, and that's just so much tempo and so much value. Flurry is the second best talent. The slow effect is always useful. Jaina goes in and can slow a whole bunch of, and because it frosts the enemies, that means that the enemy's attack speed is also reduced, so the enemies deal less damage to your minis. So that's always a useful ability, but the problem with that is just that clear casting is so overwhelmingly powerful with the way Jaina is usually played with spells, that Flurry doesn't really get much of a chance. Blink, on the other hand, Blink was an early favorite, but it's actually sometimes even detrimental because Jaina can blink into awkward directions, and generally it's just not nearly as good as the other two. For Maiev Shadowsong, Remorseless is generally the most popular option. Deal double damage for 2 seconds after killing an enemy, so Maiev can start killing stuff and just becomes more and more powerful. Enveloping Shadows is another decent option. You can avoid putting Smoke Bomb into your deck if you want to stealth your minis by putting Enveloping Shadows on your Maiev, and then Maiev can be your Smoke Bomb and a mini on top. Shadow Step can help Maiev close the distance of deployment, but Shadow Step in general is lackluster compared to the other two. Tirion Fordring's Divine Shield is indeed divine. If Tirion is your main tank, or even if Tirion isn't your main tank, as long as Tirion is doing any tanking, Divine Shield is so incredibly powerful because get a magical shield at 30% health, absorbing all damage for 5 seconds. That's complete immunity. There's very few effects in this game that give complete immunity, and that means that no matter how much damage the enemy is piling on Tirion, Tirion is going to survive those seconds, and your backline is going to be able to deal damage during those seconds, and that makes Divine Shield just totally bonkers. Vitalite can be strong if you use Tirion in a second line role, so Tirion heals your main tank more, but it still doesn't hold a candle to Divine Shield. Then there's Consecrate, good against squads, but generally the weakest of the 3 talents. Malfurion Stormrage is an incredibly powerful leader, but most of Malfurion's power actually comes from his baseline abilities, so talents don't even contribute that much. That said, Germinate is the best talent. It protects your base, and it can also protect towers as they are being built, so if you play Malfurion gets the seeds on your base, for example, and then you capture a tower within 30 seconds, and while tower is being built, tower gets protection from that, and that can be a very valuable asset. My second pick would be Deep Slumber, even though I don't like Deep Slumber that much, but Deep Slumber is a little bit unique because it allows Malfurion to be placed somewhere and just stay alive. So it's most powerful when Malfurion is placed in a corner somewhere. So we drop Malfurion off so that Malfurion won't be bothered, and then Malfurion provides permanent healing. But then Malfurion doesn't use the seeds on your base, doesn't use seeds on your tanks, doesn't provide DPS, so there are different downsides to it as well. Also, the healing does not stack. If you have multiple Malfurions, you don't get more healing. When I was testing this, I actually used 7 Malfurions. Yeah, it didn't do anything more than 1 Malfurion. So multiple copies of Malfurion are useless with this talent. And then if you want to play other Malfurions, then you have to try to play them at the front line so that they would awaken when an enemy would hit them. And that's just really awkward. But Natural Salve, the third one, is not that strong either. It provides minor healing, but it requires that you put some poison minis into your deck. And Cenarius and Elias don't really provide a lot of poison minis, so then you want to use stuff like Plague Farmer and stuff like Chimaera, which can be okay. But it's still just a minor improvement in Malfurion's survivability. Cairne Bloodhoof has 2 talents that people use, and I like Reincarnation the best. After death, resurrect at 50% health once. So that just gives Cairne basically 50% additional health, makes Cairne such a better tank, and it's just wonderful. Some people do like planes running as well, move 50% faster and gain the fast rate, because it is pretty hilarious when Cairne just zooms around the map. But then Cairne has a lot less health than with Reincarnation, so that's why I think planes running is only the second choice. And Aftershock, when stun expires, affected enemies are dazed for 5 seconds. That just doesn't do a whole lot. Dazed is only a movement speed reduction. It doesn't reduce the attack speed or anything, so it's just generally the weakest of the control effects. Sneed is a fun leader, and once upon a time you were able to rack up tons of levels on Sneed, and then Sneed just became a killing machine. But those days are long gone because Landcrab was nerfed to the ground. So now the best Sneed talent is Lead with Greed. Gain an additional 2 gold when Sneed triggers Sneed before Greed. And this truly shines in co-op content, because in co-op content you send Sneed to open a chest, and Sneed opens a chest, and both players get a ton of gold. And that's just wonderful. The second best Sneed talent is Might is Money Friend. That makes Sneed a miner. And Sneed is not a regular miner because Sneed mines the entire vein with a single go. So even if there's 3 nuggets of gold, Sneed goes in, mines, you get all 3 nuggets immediately. So that can be very useful. However, sometimes it also makes Sneed ignore fights. So Sneed spots, ooh, there's gold over there. And then Sneed just zooms towards that gold and forgets to fight back. And that can sometimes be a good thing too, because Sneed then picks up the gold before dying, hopefully. So there's upsides and downsides with that talent. And finally there's Landcrab, but Landcrab nowadays is gain a level whenever Sneed before Greed triggers. It used to be much more lenient, it gave Sneed a lot more levels. So nowadays it requires siege damage units to destroy towers, capture meeting stones or open chests. And it can be hard to get those extra levels, and then they're also capped at 10. So it's just the weakest talent nowadays. Grommash Hellscream has 2 really fun talents. The best is probably Mirror Image. Mirror Image summons 2 fragile mirror images when entering combat. It adds immediate damage, and also the mirror images, when they enter combat, they also taunt the enemy. So the enemy is going to turn away from Grom for a while in order to kill the mirror images first, which is another advantage of the talent. But obviously it is just a little bit of front-loaded damage, and if there's some AoE or something coming, and those images can die really quickly and then they're just gone. Whereas Savage Strikes, which admittedly is only my second choice nowadays, it's great against big enemies, especially big bosses that you just engage and then you don't get to kill them immediately, and then they're left with lower health, and then Savage Strike Grom deal double damage to enemies who are below 50% health, just goes in and finish them off, and that is just wonderful. But Mirror Image, being better in the early fight, is usually a little bit stronger because early fights are just so important. Then there's also Blade Storm, but Blade Storm doesn't proc often enough and doesn't deal enough damage, so it's just bad. Rend Blackhand also has 2 wonderful talents. The first choice, typically kind of vanilla choice, is Scale and Steel. Gain resistant while flying and armored while dismounted, so Rend just becomes so much harder to kill. And Rend already deals quite a lot of damage, so this is a pretty good talent. However, my favorite talent for Rend is the second choice, which is Flaming Soul. Cast Living Bomb upon dismounting, damaging nearby enemies. So it casts a 6 gold spell for free, but it's only good if there's groups of enemies. But if there's large groups of enemies coming at you, and then your Rend gets dismounted and Living Bombs them and everything dies, then it's simply wonderful. But it's much more situational than Scale and Steel, and that's why it should only be the second pick. And then there's Legionnaire, but that's largely useless. General Drakkisath is played with its top talent almost all the time because its top talent is so good. Chromatic Scales. Chromatic Scales grants nearby allies the resistant trait, so reduces the damage they take from elemental damage by 50%. Chromatic Scales can help protect your troops and it's just so good. There's really no reason to use anything else. Situationally, sometimes you can consider piercing blows, attack pierce through enemies in a line, but it's just usually not worth it. Chromatic Scales is so good. And then there's Lasting Legacy, but it doesn't even do much, so you don't want to pick that as one of your first two options. Ragnaros the Firelord doesn't really have any strong talents, although Radiant Flames is clearly the best one. Buildings you control periodically damage nearby enemies, so they pulse with fire, and it works even without playing Ragnaros. So just playing Ragnaros in your deck, you don't ever have to deploy Ragnaros. These buildings are always going to have this. So for example, if your opponent has something like chickens, well yeah, those chickens are going to get burned really well. So somewhat useful at all times. Whereas then Sons of Flame, second choice, at 50% health, summon 2 fire elementals that last 8 seconds. It can help when enemies hit Ragnaros at range because Ragnaros doesn't have a very long range, so Ragnaros sometimes just sits there and waits to be killed. So then he gets at least some fire elementals. But they last only a short time, so they're not that good. And Concussive Blast is mostly useless because Blast Wave itself is useless. Emperor Thaurissan has a clear first choice for a talent, and that talent is Hubris. Hubris, after playing Thaurissan, your next non-elemental mini deploys with +2 levels, and bonus levels make mini so much stronger. That's 21% additional DPS from that mini, for example, so it's just totally bonkers. That's by far the number one talent for Thaurissan. Then there's Incinerate. Lava Spike's burn is permanent, but it's not actually always permanent, because it's not permanent on bosses and on bases. It merely doubles the burn duration on those, but it doesn't just burn them to death. First of course thought that, okay, if I'm going to hit a base and then it's just going to burn to death. But no, it doesn't work that way, so Incinerate is not that strong. But it can still be okay. And then there's Moira's Wit. Nearby burning enemies heal Thaurissan, but it does not heal nearly enough, so there's never any reason to pick that one. Baron Rivendare also has a clear top choice for a talent, and that's Chill of the Grave. The talent has been nerfed multiple times by making those skeleton mages spawn slower and slower, but it's still by far the best. Some skeletal mages instead of warriors. And mages, they freeze and they shoot air, so they are super strong. So Chill of the Grave will always be your first pick with Rivendare. Then there's Death Pact. Periodically sacrifice a nearby skeleton to be healed, which is kind of okay, you can build around it, but it's much weaker. And then nearby allied skeletons gain bloodloss with Skeletal Frenzy, but that's very specific build around talent that really there's no reason to use that. For Bloodmage Thalnos, the choice is also clear, and the choice is Bane. Playing a spell increases attack speed by 30% for 5 seconds. That's a big damage increase. There's just no reason to use any other Thalnos talent. Because then there's Dominance, spells costing 4 or more grant an additional level. That's clunky, there's not that many expensive spells. And then there's Drain Life, Gain Lifesteal, which sounds really nice. But they have nerfed the lifesteal percentage for that talent so low that it just doesn't drain enough life to be worth it. So Bane is by far the number one choice for Thalnos. Sylvanas Windrunner was reworked in November, and she's now a super strong leader. And her best talent right now, well, actually she has 2 really strong talents. But I think first I would pick Queen's Reach. Black Arrow travels 20% farther, so that increases Sylvanas' range by 20%. So then Sylvanas will outrange most bosses, and Sylvanas will outrange all towers except for rocket towers. And that means that Sylvanas can often just shoot at stuff out of range, and then that's just totally bonkers. However, sometimes you don't want to use Sylvanas to be your main damage dealer, and in that case Forsaken Fury is wonderful. Windrunner Aura also grants Fury to Horde and Undead allies. And Windrunner Aura is active even if Sylvanas is not on the board, so just having Sylvanas in your deck, your Horde and Undead allies will have Fury. Fury means that when they start hitting, then they start hitting faster and faster, and that means that you can make some gargoyles and then they just smack through everything. So it's totally wonderful. It says allies, but currently it only buffs your own minis in co-op, so that's probably a bug, but we'll see what happens with that. Finally, there's Banshee's Veil. Banshee's Veil can help your Banshee survive Sylvanas dies and summons a Banshee. It's a range 8 stun, so even if Sylvanas is killed by most ranged units, then those will get stunned so that they will get possessed by the Banshee, but it's still less useful than Queen's Reach and Forsaken Fury, which are both awesome. Cenarius can summon a lot of treants for you. So Force of Nature summons treants from Cenarius' roots, but also from Dryad roots and any other roots. But only ground minis, because only ground minis can be rooted, and only when Cenarius is alive. This is not a completely passive effect. But still, all those treants that you're going to get, they're going to tank for Cenarius. They're just going to be really wonderful. My second pick would be Revitalize. It procs additional heals from any allied minis, so each chicken that comes in, each new vulture that's summoned. But still, a single tick of Cenarius healing is still quite small, so Revitalize doesn't heal your stuff nearly that much as you would first think. Then there's Wild Growth Global Root Effect. Not only ground minis can be rooted, but that's only on deploy, so then you have to be holding Cenarius and then at the right time drop it, and then you can get that global root, which might have its uses as well. But generally most of the time you just want Force of Nature, so that you will have all those treants, and those treants will help tank for you, and they will take the damage instead of your actually valuable minis, and that will just lead you to victory. For Onu Ancient of Lore, the first choice is clear, and that's From the Trees. Minis deployed within safe harbor deal double damage on their first attack. So that's a lot of damage. It doesn't work with sappers, by the way, so you can't just drop goblin sappers and then have them go at the enemy's base. No, it doesn't work that way. But anything else like pyromancers and stuff, and boom, they're just going to blow through the opposition. So that's simply wonderful. My second choice would be Petrify. That can keep your Onu push going, as you can deploy another Onu when your first Onu dies, because there's still the Petrify effect online. And finally there's Barkskin, but I haven't found that to be that useful. Your tank should already have whatever traits you need for the particular map, and then getting that armor. There's also a lot of elemental damage. Armor doesn't help against elemental damage, so I just don't like Barkskin that much. Ysera the Dreamer is a really different leader because it does not appear in your deck at all. Instead, you're going to have 4 different Ysera minis, while you technically only have 1 mini in your deck, and then it just changes shape to one of these 4 minis, always in the same order as well. And the best talent is Recurring Dream. It adds a second changing Ysera mini, and that goes in the opposite direction. The normal Ysera mini that you have always starts as an Innovate, and then it becomes Whelps, and then Hibernate, and then Drake. And the Recurring Dream starts as a Drake, then it becomes Hibernate, then Whelps, and then Innovate. So then you will have a wider selection of these Ysera minis available. They're pretty cost effective, and you want to build a deck that can make good use of those. And Recurring Dream will just give you so many of them. And then there's Shared Dream. Hibernate applies to all enemies on the board. Shared Dream can help you stall the game, but it loses power rapidly if you're underleveled. The Hibernation starts from 8 seconds of sleep, but it loses minus 0.9 seconds per level that the enemy is higher level than you, so if you're trying to push up in PvE, for example, then Shared Dream just doesn't do that much. And finally there's Corrupted Dream. User actually has 3 kind of usable talents, because Corrupted Dream makes Whelps apply 2 stacks of poison, it makes the Drake apply 6 stacks of poison per attack, so that's a lot of poison. But these minis are generally quite slow and quite fragile, so they're not your main poison appliers anyway. You're probably having something like Harpies or Chimaera instead, so that limits the usefulness of Corrupted Dream a little bit and makes it the third choice. Charlga Razorflank is the most unique leader in the game, because Charlga gives you a separate mini deck and a cost deck, and then you can mix and match and get to play really big minis for cheap, and sometimes you end up playing kobolds for a larger cost, but it all evens out in the end, so the average cost remains the same, and when you play it properly you can get big tempo swings, and then you can use a lot of gold on weaker minis when there's more time. So Cavernous Mist in general is the strongest because it reduces the average cost of your deck. And the cost reduction, of course, it's just 1 cost from Charlga specifically, but it's still useful. Then there's Nature's Grasp. Root 2 additional nearby targets but deal half damage. There's actually some fights where it's useful to root multiple targets so that they can't move, and Charlga can just stay there and keep them in check. And finally there's Spirit Passage. It can be used to give something like Gargoyle a stealth in some situations, but because it needs to be exactly 5 gold, it kind of limits your deck construction, and that makes it a little bit weaker. I do like the idea of the talent, but in practice using it is just a little bit hard. Hogger is hilarious that it just becomes faster and faster the more you play it, and Hamhock really emphasizes this. Hogger also gains plus 10% max health each time he is played, so then not only does Hogger become faster, but Hogger also becomes more durable. Do note that this caps at 3 stacks, so you can't just make an infinitely big Hogger. But Hogger already deals a bunch of damage, and this survivability really helps Hogger, so Ham Hog is your option number 1. Option number 2 would be Spoiled Meat, because then Hogger gains poison, and when Hogger is really fast, then Hogger applies a lot of poison. So that's going to be good, especially in dungeons if you get the lifesteal relic, so then Hogger deals tons of damage and steals life and just cannot be killed. Whereas Fatal Frenzy on Death Bloodlust Nearby Beast just doesn't do much at all. Old Murk-Eye can really swarm the enemy with Murlocs, and I think the first pick that I would make for Old Murk-Eye would be Marathon of the Murlocs. March of the Murlocs lasts an additional 5 seconds longer after deploying, so this gives you more time to get those Murlocs going out there, usually 1 or 2 extra Murlocs, and that's just going to be really useful. And it's going to make March of the Murlocs easier to use, so it also makes Murk-Eye more user-friendly. My second choice would nowadays be Tip of the Spear, because Tip of the Spear can give you fast attacks with frontal deployment. Tidehunter is going to spawn at Old Murk-Eye's location, but it's vulnerable to AoE and occasionally it's not that useful, so it really depends whether you really want it or not, but it is something unique. I do also like Electric Eel, so Murk-Eye actually has 3 usable talents, because that stun can really help. Against something like an Abomination, you can almost stun lock them with Murk-Eye, and then they just can't do anything because the Murk-Eye keeps them stunned. They can be dangerous foes before they hit, but generally it's only the third choice because Marathon of the Murlocs is so strong and makes playing Murk-Eye just easier, and then Tip of the Spear contributes something unique, and you kind of want to have these unique abilities in your repertoire in case you need them in some specific fights. When I'm recording this video, Anub'arak is not in the game yet. Anub'arak is going to arrive in a few days, but I'm going to make a pinned comment down below and I'm going to update that as soon as I can test Anub'arak and let you know what the best talents are. We do know the talents. There's Regenerate, Explosive Shells and Trapdoor, and we also know that Explosive Shells are going to deal 35 damage per beetle, and the Trapdoor Scarabs are in addition to the limit of 12 active Scarabs that you usually have. But which one is going to be the best one? We will have to test, and I will update the comment. The same applies to Orgrim Doomhammer. Orgrim Doomhammer is going to come in around 2 weeks from when I'm recording this, so pinned comment is going to be where I'm going to update when I test Orgrim. All of Orgrim's talents are going to update various aspects of his Mak'gora. They either make you win it more easily, you can gain local advantage after winning it, or you can gain a brief global buff after winning it. And once I'm able to test it, I will let you know which ones of these are the best. Then we have the regular troops in alphabetical order, so starting from Abomination. And Abomination's best talent is without doubt Noxious Presence. Poison nearby enemies every 3 seconds. Poison is really strong, and this every 3 seconds is enough to maintain poison, because poison lasts for 5 seconds unless it's refreshed. And it has a good chunk of damage, it keeps the poison on nearby enemies, it's just wonderful. The second best talent is Cannonball. On deploy and at 50% health, stun nearby enemies for 5 seconds. That's a long stun. But it's difficult to proc it at the right time, so it's just not as good as Noxious Presence. Then there's Fresh Meat, but Fresh Meat is a little bit lackluster because you have to be able to hook a suitable target and then hit it. And if you don't have anything to hook, for example, then Fresh Meat just doesn't do anything. For Agent of War, the choice is clear and the choice is Lightning Rod. If played for 4 or more, redirect enemy spell and Unbound deploys to Agent of War's current location. It's a game changer for PvP, it's also strong in specific PvE encounters where you want to redirect Unbounds or spells, like Ragnaros in Molten Core, for example, so you almost always see Ancient of War being played with Lightning Rod. The only other talent that you could really consider would be the Sapling. Sapling adds a lot of DPS to cheap Ancients, but it's just completely overshadowed by the Lightning Rod. And then there's Behemoth, but Behemoth is just bad, because if you want the Behemoth effect, just play a Molten Giant in your deck, and Molten Giant is better than Ancient of War if you just go for that siege damage. Angry Chickens are one of the highest DPS minis in the game, and Furious Fowl is their top talent, gain Fury. So then they deal even more damage, and that's just wonderful. If you want damage, they're glass cannons, you want them to deal as much damage as they can. My second choice would be the Walking Crate, because it can help your chickens sometimes get to the target, although it can also sometimes hinder them. But it's hilarious in some cases where you can get copies of minis that you play, for example in Nashala, so you're going to get 2 crates, and those crates are going to be full of chickens, both of them, so that can be useful. Then the Sacrifice. Nearby beast allies can consume a chicken to heal themselves. It can be useful with other beasts, but generally it's just not that common. Arcane Blast, I would generally start with Arcane Power. Spell sequence starts at rank 3 and ends at rank 4 because it makes the spell hit a lot harder. The rank 1 and rank 2 Arcane Blasts are not that great, and then rank 3 and rank 4 are where the power is, so getting immediate those, for example with Jaina, is definitely useful. However, I could also consider Torrent. Torrent gain a level after casting rank 4. It has found a use case with raids. Raid fights are a little bit longer, so with these long co-op fights you can play a lot of Arcane Blasts and you can get a lot of levels for that, and then as you reach overtime your Arcane Blast is a monster, and I have actually had a ton of fun playing Torrent Arcane Blast in raids. And finally, there's Amplification, easy to use, can make a difference with something like Thalnos where you want to keep playing these spells, and Arcane Blast is going to have a bigger and bigger effect, but still Arcane Power and Torrent I think are the two best ones. For Banshee, I almost exclusively play Will of the Necropolis, fully heal the possessed target. Typically your target is going to have taken a lot of damage by the time you manage to possess it, and then boom, fully healed and ready to serve your troops, so that's just always strong. Unholy Frenzy, well, it's good if you have an immediate target to hit with the Bloodlust, but that just doesn't happen always. And then Soul Eruption, it's a little weaker, the detonation is not that strong, so I think Will of the Necropolis is what you play with Banshee almost all the time. The strongest Batrider talent is Enchanted Vials, increase the size of the flaming pool by 30%. You often have a tank keeping enemies in place, and then Batrider is going to cast those vials, and the further back they extend to the backline the better, so that's typically the strongest. Flaming Peach can be really useful when Batrider is sent alone against melee troops, especially if you want to delay those melee troops. So Batrider doesn't deal enough damage to them, but you don't want them to reach the target. Then, of course, making them slower is useful. And then there's Fiery Surplus, accidentally vials on the ground, burning nearby enemies that touch them. But it's a little bit too situational. The burn effect is just not strong enough for this kind of effect that you would leave as a trap, especially from a rather slow mini like Batrider. Blizzard has one talent that is just so far ahead of the others, and that's Cold Snap, freeze enemy troops in place. So this ensures that every enemy troop is taking full damage from Blizzard, they can't move away from it, it limits their movement, it slows them down, it's just so good. Ice Crown can sometimes be useful, summons an additional Blizzard at your base, but I mean Cold Snap is just so much better. And then there's Brittle Ice, enemies within take 30% additional damage from physical sources, but it requires that you have Blizzard and then you have physical damage troops, and that's really situational, you're just not going to have that set up all the time. Bog Beast is a resistant tank, and with the right talent it can also be an armored tank, because Living Wood gain armor until 50% health. However, Living Wood does not return if Bog Beast goes below 50% health and then comes back up, so you don't get that armor pack. And that makes it weak in healing comps, but best in non-healing comps. Then the real question becomes, do you use Bog Beast in healing comps or not, because you typically would use Bog Beast together with something like Cenarius or Malfurion, and that would actually mean that Flourish would be the best talent. Flourish heals received are 30% more effective, so then when you use that with a healer, then that just gives Bog Beast more health overall. Finally, there's Rampant Growth on Death Root nearby enemies for 6 seconds, which isn't nearly as useful as the other two. Chain Lightning's top talent is Brilliant Flash. Stuns are powerful. Even though it's only a brief stun, then it will force the enemies to retarget. So when they get stunned, then they have to pick a new target after they recover from the stun. So that can have really good effects with Chain Lightning. Then there's Reverberation, it adds a little bit flexibility to the spell because you can cast it twice. And finally Storm's Reach, drastically increased jump distance between targets, which can be okay against dispersed foes, but then again, how often do you have foes that are such dispersed, and then this would still be useful. I use cheat that almost exclusively with Vampirism. Affected minis are healed when dealing damage, so that means that not only do your minis survive a lethal blow, but then they also heal back up, and that's just wonderful. Especially in combination with something like a Chimaera, for example, that poisons the enemy and then it just heals so quickly. You could also consider using Seal Fate sometimes. Affected minis gain Bloodlust but die when the effect ends. So that's good for a final push, but that also limits the way that you can use the spell, because those minis are going to die at the end. And finally there's Apocalypse. Affected skeletons resurrect at your base when they die, but that's super specific and super niche. Chimaera is a wonderful poison mini, and when you have a poison mini and you can make it even more poisonous, you will make it even more poisonous. Corrosive Breath, Poison Spit inflicts twice as much poison. That adds a lot of poison, so it doubles the poison stacks per hit from 2 to 4, and it's by far the best talent for Chimaera, really. It's just phenomenal. The second best would be Leviathan, because it increases the survivability of the Chimaera. It can only stack up to 3 stacks, but it can still give Chimaera a bunch of health, but then it loses a bunch of DPS from the poison. And the weakest talent is Frost Shock. Lightning Ball applies frost on hit. It's nice that it applies frost because it makes the enemies attack a little bit slower, but the poison head is always the one that's going to shoot first. So it takes time for even the frost head to shoot, and then the enemies have already time to shoot before that, so it's just not that good. For Core Hounds, your first pick should always be Eternal Bond. Resurrection range is unlimited. This allows you to split push with Core Hounds. So you can put Core Hounds right on the line between 2 deployment zones. They go their separate ways, and whenever one dies, the other one resurrects it from across the map. And that's best use for Core Hounds. Then, as second one, you can pick up Guard Dog, deal 50% additional damage near friendly towers and meeting stones, so for a bit of defensive damage. And finally, there's also Fire Rebirth on resurrection damage nearby enemies, a little bit of damage, but not much. Darkeye Miner's best talent is Dwarven Ambition, Gain Fury. It adds damage and it also adds mining speed. The Darkeye Miner also gets Fury when mining, so it's just a phenomenal talent. The second best is Gold Mine. After mining, drop a Proximity Mine. Damages nearby enemies when touched. This can deny mining from kobolds, for example. And finally, there's Dark Iron Armaments. After mining, gain Armored. Well, it helps it tank a little bit after mining, but generally that is the weakest talent. Darkspear Troll has attractive talents in abundance, but if I had to choose, the first pick would go to Big Bad Voodoo. Regenerate 20% health every second. This adds crazy survivability to the Troll. You can also give it armor, you can give it resist with other minis, you can add a healer, and Troll is just going to be so good. And just with that healing alone, it can already solo so many fights that it would otherwise lose to. And my second pick would be Serpent Sting, because poison is always strong. So that's good damage increase, helps work together with other poison minis, just phenomenal. And the last one would be Head Hunting. It can be strong if you have a good frontline that protects the troll, but then the troll tends to outrun all your allies and go off and kill itself, so that's why I don't like Head Hunting as much as the other two. For Deep Breath, Double Dragon used to be the choice, but it was nerfed and now it makes Deep Breath more expensive, and that's just catastrophic. So the choice is between Melting Point and Attunement. Both of those have some benefits, but not too many. However, I would pick Melting Point first, because it can make the surviving minis weaker against physical damage, or if you're up against Ragnaros, then Ragnaros' leader ability won't work with them anymore after you remove the armor, so that's why Melting Point is good. And you're always going to shoot at some hostile minis anyway, so you're probably going to get good value out of that most of the time. Whereas Attunement, it grants resist to your minis, but only for 10 seconds. Note, it can still be valuable in some cases, but you're not shooting your own minis all the time, so I would only pick that second. And Double Dragon, now with the increased cost, it is too expensive. Defias Bandits have two really good talents, and it's kind of hard to decide between the two, because first of all there's Deadly Poison. It's significantly more damage, it synergizes with other poison minis and it's always useful, so it's a great pick. But there's also Picklock, earn an extra +2 gold when opening chests, and if there are chests on the map, then sometimes that is just totally phenomenal. But of course if there are no chests, then that's completely useless. So I think Deadly Poison would be my first pick and Picklock would be my second. And last resort, it can help control fight a little bit, but I don't like it too much. Generally the strongest talent for Dire Batlings is Midnight's Call. On kill gain stealth, because this allows Batlings to ambush small minis. So Batlings come in and stealth, and they kill a mini and they gain stealth again. The entire pack gains stealth whenever they kill a mini, so that's wonderful, but they do need to kill somebody first, because they don't have stealth when they're summoned. So you need to summon them so that they can get a first kill, and after that they can just keep ambushing things, and that's wonderful. The second choice is harder. I think I might go for Guano Happens after all nowadays, because it has some niche uses for breaking stealth, for example. Those poison pools that they're dropping can be useful in filling maps with poison, because Batlings are also really fast, so they're going to poop all over the map once you release them. However, Soundbite is not bad either. It's the only real DPS increase, but note that the Sonic Wave cannot hit the main target, so there needs to be another enemy mini around that the Sonic Wave can go to, so that the Batlings will gain the DPS increase. Soundbite can really hurt those. Drake's strongest talent is Mother Drake, periodically summon a whelp egg, so that's going to add a lot of eggs on your path, and that has many uses. As for the second talent, I used to pick Engulfing Flames for that additional damage, because Engulfing Flames Drake actually does quite a lot of damage. But nowadays I'm beginning to think that maybe Ruse should be the second pick, perch on top of a nearby tower, staying there to defend it. It has seen some play, for example, in some Onyxia strategies. It's very niche, but it's also very unique. So if you don't have that ability, then you just don't have that ability. So maybe Mother Drake into Roost is actually better than Mother Drake into Engulfing Flames. Riot brings something unique to the table with Nature's Swiftness, which is the best talent. It's a unique effect. Grant rapid movement speed to an ally, ability has 1 charge. Note it doesn't stack with other speed talents, but you can give very fast speed to Gargoyle or an Abomination. If it's Gargoyle, you can't use Wing Buffet on Gargoyle, because then that's also a speed talent, and then these two don't stack. Dryad refuses to buff the Gargoyle. But if you have another talent or no talent on Gargoyle, then Gargoyle just becomes super fast. Second pick would probably be Barrage, favor new targets when possible, because Dryad roots targets that it hits, so it's useful in rooting multiple enemies and limiting their movement. Taunts, on the other hand, is generally not useful, because Dryad just does not last long against melee characters anyway. From my perspective, Earth Elemental has 2 useful talents. My first pick would be Obsidian Shard, on that split into 2 smaller Earth Elementals, because their unit is more sticky and it just tanks for ages with that. However, I also do like Ready to Rumble, Taunt on Deploy. Taunt effects generally are a little bit undervalued. They are actually pretty strong, because they force the enemy to do something it doesn't want, and then that can just allow you to deal so much damage to them. It's more situational for sure. Obsidian Shard, just all that bonus health that it gets from that makes it the number 1 choice, but Ready to Rumble should be the second one. Whereas Shrapnel Blast, destroying a tower, deals damage to nearby enemies, that just occurs too rarely, so it's not useful. Earth and Moon has 1 generally useful talent, then it has 1 niche talent and 1 pretty useless talent. So Moon Fury, Starfall lasts 25% longer, that makes Starfall a big damage spell, so that's pretty strong sometimes. Then there's Nature's Grace. Entangling Roots also grants all allies resist for 6 seconds. That's niche, but global resist, that's nothing to scoff at, it can be useful. And then there's Balance, can be cast a second time. But this works like Arcane Blast levels or Raptors or stuff like this, so you have to cast Earth and Moon again immediately after you cast it, so you always have to cast both forms. If you started with Starfall, then you also have to cast Entangling Roots, and you have no option around that, and that makes it much weaker. Eclipse has 2 really strong talents and 1 useless one, because it has Solar Flare. Sunfire also burns enemies. That's a big damage increase, and it works even if Eclipse is the only spell in your deck, so that would be the one that I would pick first. It just makes Eclipse so much stronger. Although Celestial Focus is also useful, spells gain 2 levels if played immediately after Sunfire or Moonfire, and Eclipse is cheap enough that you can actually use this cycling effect, and then you can get those big spells going. So for example, Jaina into Eclipse into Execute, so that can work, and Celestial Focus can be strong in that. Whereas Umbral Force, Moonfire also stuns enemies for 1 second, that's largely useless. Execute has 3 talents that are all somewhat useful, although one of them goes ahead of the others, and that one is Bloodthirsty. Bloodlust allies within spell area for 10 seconds. So this is essentially 2 spells in one. You have Harpies hitting at the boss, you execute, that deals damage to the boss, bloodlust your Harpies, it's just totally wonderful. Then there's Overpower, knock enemies away from the cast location. It changes the playstyle a little bit. It can be detrimental, but it also does some really weird things, like, for example, in Mechanic Thermoblock encounter, there are switches, and if you execute them with Overpower, then they actually move a little bit. So some weird stuff can happen with Overpower. And finally, there's Killing Spree. If an enemy is killed, the next Horde mini costs 1 less. This also works even if Execute is the only Horde mini in your deck. Then if Execute kills something, the next Execute is discounted. But there's often also positions where you don't kill anything with Execute, and then of course you don't get the cost reduction, so this is the most situational one. Faerie Dragon's Fey Blessing is unique and situationally powerful. It gives your tanks additional protection against elemental damage, and that makes it really, really strong. The second pick would be Invisibility, gain stealth, so that allows Faerie Dragon to win more fights because it can surprise its enemies. Whereas the third talent, Phase Shift, is actually really, really bad. It's often actively harmful because Faerie Dragon has very low range. So typically what happens is Faerie Dragon comes in and it gets shot at, and it actually takes damage before it teleports back, so then it teleports back and then it comes back in and then it gets shot at again before it can do anything. So yeah, Phase Shift is just terrible. Fire Elemental is almost always played with Immolation Aura, periodically damage nearby enemies. It adds more damage, it's totally bonkers with lifesteal in dungeons, so it's just really, really strong. I think my second pick would be Fan the Flames. Taking elemental damage increases damage dealt by 10%, stacks to 30%. It's situational, but in heavy elemental damage fights it can actually be useful. And finally there's Molten Core. On death, summon a pool of lava, damaging enemies within, but that's usually less damage overall than the others. My number one pick for Firehammer talent is Heightened Rage, level up upon reaching Full Fury. So this can give you multiple levels. If you reach Full Fury and you drop Combat, and then you can level, and then you start building Fury again, you reach Full Fury, you drop Combat, you get more levels. It's wonderful if you can get a few fights in. My second pick would be Molten Metal because of its uniqueness. Deal 50% more damage to flying enemies. It's very specific. You want to fight against some specific flying bosses, for example, but sometimes it can be very, very powerful. And my last pick would be Blazing Speed. Blazing Speed is almost as good as Heightened Rage, and sometimes it's even better than Heightened Rage, but in general it loses a little bit, and then I want the Molten Metal for the unique effect, so that leaves Blazing Speed as the last one. It's fastest damage increase, but loses to extra levels if you can get 2 extra levels, so that's kind of its problem. For Flamewaker, all 3 talents have some merit. I think I would pick Backdraft first. The range does not affect the first attack, but once Flamewaker is stable there and attacks multiple times, it can start reaching the back line of the enemy, and that's really, really powerful. Then there's Engulf. Damaging enemies burns them, it's damage, and damage is really good. And finally there's Heatstroke. Damaging enemies daisies them. So that can sometimes be good if Flamewaker is alone, and then it daisies the enemies so the enemies don't reach Flamewaker as quickly if they're melee enemies, but overall it's a little bit underwhelming and more niche. Footmen have 2 strong talents and 1 a little bit more niche talent. There's Shield Bash, periodically stun the target for 1 second. That's universally useful, and stun also forces the enemy to retarget. So Footman, if the enemy is shooting at something else, Footman comes in, stuns the target, the enemy is going to turn and attack the Footman. That can be really strong. Then there's Fortification, gain 30% extra empty health. It's used in healing decks, and it is the strongest talent if you run these in a healing deck, like you run these in a Malfurion deck or a Cenarius deck. Fortification can work wonders there. And then there's Last Stand, armor increases to 75% damage reduction when no other footmen are nearby. You can split push with footmen, send 2 and 2, and then there's only 1 and 1 left, and Last Stand gives them a little bit more armor, but it usually just does not do enough. Frostwolf Shaman is wonderful and has 2 really strong talents. My first pick would always still be Earth Shield. Grant armor to a nearby ally, ability has 1 charge. So you can buff a Fire Elemental with this, or Drakkisath, or Abomination, and they can be incredibly strong. They have the healer behind them and they get armor that they just roll over stuff. The second pick would be Earthwall Totem. Once per deploy, place a totem that partially heals a nearby tower or base. This has seen a lot of play in PvP, and there are some PvE encounters where it can also be useful, even though it's more rarely used in PvE. Whereas the third talent, Lightning Mastery, range attack change to 3 nearby targets. Well, Shaman base damage is kind of miserable, so getting it to 3 targets just does not help. So it's not very useful talent at all. For Gargoyle, I still like to pick up Wing Buffet. It's generally the most useful talent, increases move speed by 33%. A Dryad can make Gargoyle faster than a Wing Buffet Gargoyle is. But you don't always have a Dryad, so Wing Buffet is still the one that I want. Then there's Obsidian Statue. On death, summon a statue with Taunt, lasts until destroyed. This can be useful in some coordinate pushes. You can also have some fun interactions where you want an obstacle on the map and you can use this to get that. Or you just want a target that is going to tank a little bit longer. Then there's Aerial Superiority. Incoming damage from flying minis is reduced by 50%, which could potentially be useful because it's kind of unique. But right now it just doesn't have really hardly any situations where you actually want to play with it. So that's why I'm just not using it. Ghoul is a tank and you typically want your tanks to survive, so that's why my top pick is Bone Shield. Cannibalizing grants armored for 10 seconds. And, well, you just want your Ghoul to survive. Sure, the Stays for Blood deals 50% additional damage to enemies who are below 50%, but you don't really want it to be dealing that much damage anyway. And kind of same with Ravenous, cannibalizing grants Bloodlust for 10 seconds. So, yeah, those are just not as useful as surviving for longer and doing what a tank is supposed to be doing. Null Brute has two useful talents. Generally you want to pick Rabid, because it reduces deploy cost by 1 against cycle trait, so cost reduction is good, then Null Brute only costs 2 and that's really strong. However, Thick Hide is an option. It's good against physical damage. It's still less than half of Molten Giant's health at half the cost, but it does gain more synergies with Ragnaros, for example, so there are some upsides to Thick Hide. Whereas for Pillage, deal siege damage, there's very little upside to that, so you generally just don't want that one. Clearly the strongest Goblin Sapper talent is Turbo Boots. Move twice as fast and gain the fast trait. I mean, they're much more effective at killing towers, which is their job, when they can move faster, and so Turbo Boots is just incredible. Sometimes you might want extra boom, deploy an additional +1 Goblin Sapper, so if slow Sappers are enough, then that adds more damage, because now there's 3 of them, so you deal more damage, but reaching target can be a lot more harder. And then there's Crude Gunpowder, on death burn nearby enemies, but it only helps when Sappers fail to do what they're supposed to do, which is to kill the tower, so I just don't like Crude Gunpowder at all. Gryffindor's top talent is Odin's Fury, Gain Fury. It makes Rider so much stronger against big individual targets. Rider deals so much damage, the DPS is right off the charts. I like that talent so much. For the second one, I would pick Airdrop, because there are more and more applications of Airdrop. Initially it saw some play in PvP, but now there's also a bunch of raid strategies where you level up minis like Ragnaros, for example, stationary minis, and you just get Airdrop potions on them and they get a lot of levels during the fight. And you don't get access to those strategies unless you have Airdrop, because that ability is completely unique. Finally, there's Mighty Throw. It allows you to outrange some enemies, and it allows you to win some duels, for example, because you can hit first. But overall, the DPS is just so much less than with Odin's Fury that I prefer the Fury talent. Harpies are one of the best damage dealing minis in the game, but if you have played with Harpies without a talent, then you notice that actually Harpies somehow just don't deliver. That's because Infectious Swipes is an important part of their DPS toolkit, Gain Poison. It's huge damage increase, it's a phenomenal talent, it's the one that you really want to pick first. The second pick should be Trinket Collectors, gain the Miner trait, cost is increased by 1. It's situational, but sometimes there are specific maps where you want to use Harpies also for mining, and then that's a unique ability that you gain from the talent, so you have to have it in order to do that. Finally, there's Talon Dive, deal double damage on first attack, but it's just weaker than the Poison talent. Poison talent is the best damage increase, so that's why Talon Dive is just lackluster. Harvest Golem has two useful talents. First, there's Unstable Core. On death, stun nearby enemies for 3 seconds, and stun is great, so Unstable Core is great. Harvest Golem also resurrects itself, so it stuns twice. And then the second best talent, the DPS talent, Trojan's Chickens. On death, spawn 4 Angry Chickens, so it's also going to spawn those Angry Chickens twice. That's more damage. Then there's Bountiful Harvest, but I haven't really figured out any good uses for that, to be honest. The best talent for Headless Horseman is the Near-Death Experience. At 40% health, heal to 80% health and stun nearby enemies, ability has 1 charge. So Horseman becomes sturdier, it gives stun, so it's just really good. For the second pick, I think I would go with Nightwatch because of the unique effect. The Horseman is going to return to his spot after killing enemies. So it's unlike Guard Duty or any other thing where they wake up a little bit later. Horseman is actually going to keep guarding this position. And that's something unique and potentially strong. And then there's Decapitate, on kill, gain blood loss for 5 seconds. That's more DPS, which is nice, but Needed Experience just allows Horseman to do more, and the Nightwatch is so unique, so that kind of leaves Decapitate as the third one, even though all 3 talents are useful. The main talent I use with Holy Nova is Inner Fire. Affected allies gain armored and resist for 5 seconds. I use this a lot in various cases. I use this with Chimeras, for example, sometimes with Gargoyles, just giving that armored and resist while getting some healing going. It's very useful talent, and it's basically what Holy Nova is used much of the time. My second pick would probably nowadays be Amplify Magic, just because it's so unique. Effects are doubled on all elemental minis. It requires a specific kind of deck or opponent, but it can still be useful. And then there's Renew. Renew also adds a heal over time effect to allies. It's kind of okay, but usually Inner Fire is just better, so Renew just is the third one because you have one that's stronger and then you have one that's a little bit unique, so then this Renew as the last one. Huntress has two very strong talents and one weaker one, so choice between Elven Might and Shadow Meld. Shadow Meld gains stealth and ambush, so Shadow Meld Huntress can approach its target and then suddenly attack it, very useful skill to have. Elven Might Huntress deal 50% additional damage to the initial target, is better at sustained damage. So I typically pick Shadow Meld first and Elven Might second. But if you really want to do just PvE, then maybe Elven might be worth even the first pick. This is one of those minis, one of the few minis that have two almost equally strong talents. Then there's Danassian Steel. Glaive bounces an additional 3 times, but that is not worth it. Living Bomb doesn't really require a talent, but the 2 damage talents are generally the better ones for it, and out of those I typically prefer Chain Reaction. It requires new targets, it cannot bounce back to the original one, so it doesn't just keep bouncing back and forth. That doesn't happen, sorry, it's not that strong. But when it has the biggest upsides, when there's enough targets so that it can bounce a little bit, then it can be really strong. So I think it has more upside than Blast Radius. Although Blast Radius is on average more damage than Chain Reaction, so it's also fine. Burden of Fate is just not that useful. By far the best meat wagon talent is the Filet Trebuchet at +2 range. So that's the best because it enables new strategies. There are many targets that you can just reach with that you can't reach otherwise, so it's just phenomenal. The only other real alternative is Greased Gears gain Fury, so it adds some damage, although it takes time for that Fury to stack up because Meatwagon attacks so slowly. And finally Meatwagon has the incomprehensible Meat and Bones. Every other attack summons a skeleton instead of dealing damage, which actually makes your mini worse, so you really don't want it even if it was free. My favorite Molten Giant talent is Threatening Presence, gain Taunt. Draws attention to the Molten Giant, it's just a wonderful talent. Then the second option is Blood of the Mountain. On death explode, damaging nearby enemies, but typically I find the Taunt to be more useful than the explosion. And finally there's Bolster, heal when destroying a tower, but that's way too situational, I don't think that's useful at all. Moonkin is not a very strong mini, and to make matters worse, what should be Moonkin's best talent actually doesn't do anything at the moment, because Vengeance, taking damage increases casting speed by 50% for 5 seconds, has been bugged since Moonkin was launched and it's still not fixed, so it doesn't do anything. I would still pick that for the hope that it might someday be fixed, and maybe Moonkin with that would be worth putting in your deck, because otherwise you just won't. The second option is Typhoon, knockback nearby enemies on deploy, and actually pretty funny with Onu, because then you can just knock back stuff away from Onu, and that's pretty sweet, but it's lackluster otherwise. And then there's Moonglow, spells gain 2 levels if played immediately after Moonkin, but Moonkin is too expensive to make good use of this effect. The effect itself is potentially strong, but it just doesn't work with Moonkin, so you don't want to pick that one. Mountaineer is a weak mini with weak talents. I guess Intimidation is the best. Bear gains Taunt, because that saves the Dwarf often, and then the Dwarf gets to shoot, which is really good. But it's still nothing too fancy. Then there's Frenzied Spirit. When the bear or mountaineer dies, the other gains Bloodlust. It adds some damage, but it adds damage at a very inopportune time when someone is already dead. And finally there's Mend Pets, heal up to 3 additional nearby beasts when healing the bear. So maybe there's some kind of beast deck that you could build with this, but so far none have been found, so it just isn't that good. Murloc Tidehunters are in the enviable position that they have actually 3 useful talents. My favorite is the Safety Bubble, deploy with a bubble that blocks the first attack, because Murlocs are fragile, so blocking any kind of attack, blocking infinite amounts of damage, that's really strong. Then there's Morlocks, deploy with +1 additional Murloc, so that's the most DPS you can get out of them with 3 Murlocs. And then there's also Careful Aim, gain +2 range. Range is always good, but this +2 range doesn't really give them enough range to outrange towers and stuff, so it's a little bit weaker than many other ranged talents. Necromancer has a couple of really interesting talents. My favorite is the Jewel Skulls, summon skeletal mages instead of skeletons, because skeletal mages are really good. They frost your enemies, they can shoot air, that's really strong. The second pick is Cult of the Damned. On kill, summon a skeleton. It can get you some more skeletons. It's situationally stronger than Jeweled Skulls. If you have a lot of small targets, then you can build a huge skeleton army with Necromancer, so it can be good. But typically you just want mages that can also shoot air. And finally there's Breath of the Dying. On death, summon 5 skeletons, but that is the weakest of the Necromancer talents. Ogre Mage has 2 strong talents, and third one is kind of redundant, because there's Frostfire Bolt. Gain Frost, that's wonderful for movement control and for slowing enemy attack speed. Then there's Avarice, gain Bloodlust when bloodlusting an ally, so that gives you a lot more damage. And then there's Ignite, burn enemy targets, so it also gives you more damage, but Avarice is better for that, so that means that Ignite is left in the third spot. Plague Farmer has a clear best talent that you hardly ever want to use anything else but Splashing Pumpkins. Increase range by +1 and double the splash area. It's just incredibly strong. I mean, there's really no reason to use any other Plague Farmer talent. Like, the second pick would probably be Parting Gift. On that, summon a pumpkin. When touched, it poisons nearby enemies, but there's no reason to ever use that over Splashing Pumpkins. Nor Virulence. On kill, poison enemies near the target. But yeah, Virulence can affect flying units, so that's an upside, but Splashing Pumpkins, really, just get that one. It's so good. The strongest polymorph talent is almost always Golden Fleece. One sheep becomes golden, killing it grants 1 gold. That just gives you gold advantage and makes it polymorph cheaper, and that's so good. The second choice would be Exploding Sheep. Killing a sheep damages nearby enemies, but there's very rarely a reason to use that when you can get a discount instead. And finally there's Stable Transfiguration. Lasts twice as long, but sheep regenerate health very quickly. But even if it lasts twice as long, you very rarely can do something meaningful during that time period, so it's just quite useless. For Prowler, my clear favorite is On the Prowl. Gain stealth and stun the target when attacking from stealth. Wonderful for surprise attacks. Prowler can't shoot air, so this protects Prowler from flyers because it moves in stealth. Just phenomenal. There's also Predatory Instincts, deal double damage to enemies who are at more than 75% health, so sometimes you're able to one-shot stuff with Predatory Instincts, whereas with On the Prowl you would get the first hit in and that would stun it, and then you need another hit to actually kill it, but I prefer On the Prowl to that. And finally there's Backleader, grants nearby beast allies 30% additional damage, but these beast swarms are kind of hard to put together. Pyromancer has 2 useful talents and 1 really bad talent, so my favorite one is Pyroblast. Deal triple damage on the first attack. It just helps you destroy things in one hit so much more often. Sometimes when there's first strike effects, then first strike effect makes that deal quadruple damage, so it's triple damage from the Pyroblast plus 1 more time damage from the first strike effect, but it's still just really good. Then there's Conflagrate. Splash area is doubled. It's sometimes nice, you get the damage to a little bit wider area, but overall Pyroblast is just typically stronger. And finally there's Blaze of Glory, damage and burn nearby enemies on death, but that's hardly ever useful. Quillboar's talents have been buffed a couple of times, and currently I think Bramble Burst is the best talent for this mini. Inflict poison on nearby enemies when emerging. It's inflicted quite quickly, it comes in 2 stacks, it's strong for immediate damage, it's strong for extending poison duration on a target, very useful skill in raids and in co-op content, so that's just a phenomenal talent. Bristleback is also strong, deals small amount of damage to melee attackers, even though damage is only really noticeable sometimes, like if you have chickens coming at a Quillboar and Quillboar just kills them all with Bristleback, but Bramble Burst is just more generally useful. And finally there's Tunnel Vision, deploy much more quickly, it makes the unit faster at opening chests, but otherwise it's not that strong. For Raptors, the main choice is clear, it's Strength in numbers. Deal 10% more damage for each other Raptor nearby. It adds so much damage. My second pick would be Fast Food. On kill, heal a small amount of damage. It's strong against squads, but it's very situational, but it does heal your entire pack of Raptors, so it can keep them going for quite some time. And finally there's Motivation, gain Bloodlust while a chest or gold vein is nearby. It has seen some hilarious PvP use sometimes when a lone raptor is used to push a slower mini into battle. Raptors are sometimes used like just the 1 gold raptor in PvP to push other minis, because raptors have a lot of pushing power. But it's still kind of niche, so it would be only my third pick. For safe pilot, choice is clear nowadays, it's Gnomish Cloaking Device, deploy from the explosion with stealth. You get 2 hits and the 0 point can deal with stealth pilot. It's just really, really good. I used to like coming in hot better, but coming in hot was nerfed quite hard, deploy twice as fast and burn nearby enemies, but deal 33% less crash damage. So with the nerf, coming in hot just doesn't deal enough damage anymore. And then there's Gnomish Mutonizer, polymorph the first blaster target, but it's generally not useful. Skeleton Bard is a strong mini even without any talents, and when you pick their best talent, sometimes you have to actually disable that, because it's Ritual of Rhyme. Summon 5 skeleton mages who guard the deploy location. So you deploy to important locations, and then the skeleton party is just going to stay there and deal a bunch of damage. But sometimes you need to disable this if you want your skeleton party to be something that moves, so then you have to load into battle without a talent. And the second best talent that you don't have to disable is Corpse Run. Gain +1 level for each deploy after the first, up to maximum of +3 levels. So slowly your skeleton party just becomes stronger and stronger over the duration of the game. Finally, there's Fireman. It's sometimes useful. It's an all-round talent. A Fireman skeleton party, for example, can take a tower by itself, because tank skeleton is going to taunt and then it's going to get healed and there's damage. But that tank skeleton taunting is also sometimes really, really bad for you. So it's another talent that you just have to disable occasionally when you want skeleton party to be DPS and not want it to get opponents' attention. For skeletons, you just cannot go wrong with Exhume. If deployed near a tower or meeting stone, deploy +2 additional skeletons. That's a huge army for 2 gold. It's just so good. Questing buddies, 1 skeleton gains armor, 1 gains resist, 1 gains stealth. It doesn't do a whole lot, but it would be the second choice, and then there's Cackle, gain taunt, and that does hardly anything. For Smoke Bomb, Through the Shadows, affected minis move 50% faster until unstealthed. It's universally useful, and if you Smoke Bomb something like Sappers, then them going faster is always an upside. The others are more situational. There is Band of Thieves, grant +1 level to cycle minis within, which can be sometimes useful. And then the Strangers in the Night, which is really, really strange. Effects apply to enemies as well, and that can get really confusing, and it's usually not in a good way. The main talent for Spiderlings is Envenom, deal twice as much poison damage, and it adds a lot more damage, so it's just really, really good. Then there's Bloated Carapace, explode on death, poisoning nearby enemies, but that's a little bit weaker. And then Frostbite, gain frost. It can slow enemies down, it can also slow them from attacking, but usually there's a lot more enemies than what Spiderlings are hitting, so it's actually just not that useful. Just pick Envenom for all of that poison. Stonehoof Tauren has 2 good talents. First there's Momentum, which changes what Tauren can do, because after connecting a charge, immediately charge a second time if possible. So then you can charge a tank, and then you can charge a range unit behind the tank, and that's really, really good. So that's why Momentum is typically the best Stonehoof Tauren talent. Although Pummel also has its upsides, after connecting a charge, stun the target for 3 seconds. But it doesn't allow you to reach those range units behind the tank, so it's typically weaker than Momentum. And Provoke, that taunt just doesn't do much. You're usually getting their attention anyway. For Treant, I would nowadays go for Composting first. It can heal your Treant pack if they don't all die at the same time. And after Treant got some health buffs, and if you want to play a big Treant pack, then they often don't all die at the same time, so you get some of that healing going on. The second option would be Propagation, summon 2 extra Treants for every 3 gold spent on deploy, so then you get 2 Treant packs, 1 at your base and 1 wherever you want to play them, so then you just have more Treants to play with. And finally there's Uproot. On death, root the target for 3 seconds, but that's largely ineffective. The enemy is in melee combat with the Treants anyway, so it will have something to hit at. It is not helpless there. And the effect only refreshes, it does not stack when more Treants die. So the enemy will soon be free anyway after the last Treant dies, so Uproot is just largely ineffective. Vultures may be a fairly low effect mini, but all of their talents have their upsides. I would generally pick Feeding Frenzy first. Flock gains Bloodlust for 5 seconds when spawning a new vulture, so that adds a lot of DPS. Then there's Migration. All additional vultures spawn at your base, so that means that you can just split vultures into multiple groups, so there's always going to be vultures around. And finally, Tendon Rip attacks dazed enemies for 3 seconds. It's not completely useless. Vultures don't deal a lot of damage anyway, but if they can slow the enemies down, then that can give you some control, and for very inexpensively as well, because vultures only cost 1 gold. The Warzone Grunt's talents are generally just all very disappointing. Bloodbag is the only universally useful one. When a Grunt dies, the other gains Bloodlust, but I don't really like that one. Then there's Command. Nearby beast allies deal 30% additional damage, but Grunts are too slow to keep up with those beasts, so it's also not very useful. And then there's Guard Duty. Remain at deploy location until entering combat, and it also doesn't usually do much, so Grunts just don't have good talents. For Warzone Raider, I like Saboteur the best. Damaging a tower reduces its damage dealt by 50% for 3 seconds, so you can do a lot more against towers. And sometimes I also do like Thunder Armor. Damaging an armored enemy removes their armor, so it's a little bit more situational, but it can be powerful. And I don't really like raising focus that much. Become a siege unit ignoring enemy minis, so that means that Raider is just going to beeline straight towards the tower, but I just don't find that so useful. For Whelpex, Flame Burst was nerfed, but it's still the strongest talent. It's game-changing. The damage it deals makes the unit a lot stronger, even in its nerfed state. The second best talent is Rookery. When one egg hatches, the other hatch immediately. It's weaker after it was nerfed. Do not add a whelp, so it has the same amount of whelps as Flame Burst, and typically it just doesn't do as much immediate effect. And finally there's Chromatic Plating. Eggs gain Taunt, but it's just not very useful at all. For Witch Doctor, you really want Spirit Ward. On kill, grant a shield to nearby allies, absorbing the next hit against them. The shield lasts for 5 seconds, but it adds so much survivability. It can nullify executes. It's tremendously good. The second best talent would be Amplify Curse. Enemies killed by the Curse explosion also explode. Sometimes you can get some nice explosions and then more explosions, but typically you just want the Spirit Ward. Alchemist is the weakest. Periodic drop a potion, granting Bloodlust to the first ally who touches it, because Bloodlust effect is so fleeting. And finally there's Worgen, and Worgen's best talent is clearly Premeditation. Increase ambush damage by 50%. It adds a lot of damage to Worgen, it's just phenomenal. Then there's Lone Wolf. On deploy, grant +1 gold if no allies are nearby. It can add some gold, and in co-op it can add some gold to your ally as well, but Worgen needs to be really far away from allies and doesn't have the damage from Premeditation, so it's just weaker. And Frenzy on kill gain Bloodlust for 10 seconds, that's too situational, it's not that strong. So those are all the minis and all the talents in the game, and I hope this video helps you make good decisions and improve your armies. Thank you for watching. Click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and a special thanks to all of my Patreon supporters, YouTube members and Twitch subscribers who make all of these videos possible.